Well, I have to say, I don't know when the time was, if there ever was a time when I ever really gave my whole testimony in one sitting. Um, Probably I did when I was younger a number of times, but I just have too many other things to talk about other than my own self. I have so many questions people have about other things and so forth. It just, when I have a time to speak, I generally think in terms of, talking about my story. But Mike, you requested it, and I thought, well, it has certainly been a long time, if ever, since I've given it. It's a little hard to imagine covering 7 decades in about probably 90 minutes. So I'm not really sure how well that'll go. Obviously, I'm an old man. I've had a lot of years, and they've been full years. So I have to kind of pick and choose what I'm going to say. But on the other hand, I want to kind of give you a broad sweep of who I am and what has happened in my life in the past. Well, I'll begin by saying that I was born in 1953, which makes me 69 now, and I was born into a wonderful Christian home. My parents were as good a couple as anyone could wish to be raised by. In fact, when I count my blessings, which are numerous, I always count having the parents I had as being probably the very greatest of them all. That is, of the blessings I've had. My parents had a great love for each other. They were married happily for 70 something years. My father died a couple of years ago at 95, but they were just honest, good Christian people. They weren't particularly religious, though we went to church, and my dad read his Bible all the time. And my mom, they had both been raised Christian, so they'd been Christians from their childhood, and they had 3 kids. I'm the middle child. My sister is 2 years older. Her name is Debbie, and my brother is 6 years younger. His name is David. I was born in San Bernardino, California. I lived my first 5 years with my family in San Bernardino. My younger brother was not yet born at the time, but I had an older sister. I don't, of course, have much to report about those first 5 years, except that it was a happy childhood, certainly had happy circumstances. And there is that one story, which is found in my bio online, about when I was very little. I don't know when this year happened. I know when I was 2, which would be, I guess, 1955, I was found to be diseased. They had some difficulty diagnosing it. I was starving to death, and you could tell I was starving to death by looking at me at 2 years old. My limbs were like skin and bones, and my belly was bloated like, a basketball. And it's sort of like you'd see of starving children in World Vision fundraising ads or whatever. And they couldn't figure out why, because I was eating plenty, but doctors had a hard time diagnosing it. At first, they said that I had cystic fibrosis, and that I would die because of it. And so my parents were, of course, very distraught about that, and they got on the prayer chain with their relatives and the churches that they and the relatives went to, and prayed for me to get better. My dad, I only learned this detail after I was an adult in the ministry. I grew up knowing about this disease when I was a child, but I didn't know until I was an adult and in the ministry. My father said that when he was praying for me to be healed, he also offered me to the Lord for the ministry, which is, my dad was not in the ministry himself. He worked for the electric company, and, he was a good Christian, but an unassuming one, kind of shy, kind of a homebody, spent his evenings when he was home from work largely reading the Bible or Christian books in the living room. That's the image I have of him growing up a lot. Not a real active man, not into sports very much, not into auto mechanics very much. So I didn't learn anything about those things. He wasn't into hunting or camping. I never got to do any of those things when I was young. but I didn't miss them. It wasn't particularly my interest, but I was bookish. My dad was bookish, and I was bookish. I didn't. I didn't read much, but I did read the Bible when I was young. But before that, when my dad actually had dedicated me to the Lord for ministry, my dad didn't even know what he was asking or what he was talking about, but he just was trying to bargain with God to get God to heal me and have me not die. Something happened in my room, and I do record this in my bio because I think it's significant, but I don't know what its significance is. I don't know what to make of it. It's just an unusual story. My sister and I shared a bedroom at that time in that house until I was 5 and she was 7, but this happened sometime before we moved away from there. I was probably, I don't know, I was probably 3 and she 5. But one night, a man came into my bedroom when I was asleep and called my name, and I thought it was my dad, so I said, "What, Dad?" And there was no answer, so I looked around. I'd been laying on my stomach with my face toward the wall. I looked around, and where the voice came from, there was no one there. And, I thought it was strange, but I'd been awakened from sleep, so, didn't give it much thought. I was very little. And it happened again, and again, 3 times that happened. Now, I realized, and people who are skeptical, I say, it sounds like that's a direct swipe from a Bible story, about Samuel. Well, I didn't know the story about Samuel back then, so I didn't have any ability to swipe it. This is something that actually happened, and I didn't get any message from God. It's like after the 3rd time, there was nothing. It was strange enough that I couldn't help but remember it most of my life that had happened. And later, when I was an adult, my sister and I were talking about our childhood, and she had never heard this story from me, but she said, I remember a time when we were living at Goodlett Street in San Bernardino and sharing the same bedroom. Her bed was across the room from mine, and she could see mine. She said, I remember a night that a man came in. I thought it was Dad, she said, and he stood by your bed. She said, I didn't hear him say anything, but I heard you say, "What, Dad?" 3 times. And she said, after that, he walked out into the lit hallway out of our bedroom. And she said, I remember thinking it's strange because it looked to me like the light kind of from the hallway was shining through him. And she just thought that was weird. And she told me that when she was 21 and I was 19, and we'd never discussed it before, but it seemed obvious that was the same night. And like I said, that sounds significant to me, but I have no idea what its significance is. I will say this, though. I didn't die. I didn't die of cystic fibrosis. In fact, later diagnoses said I didn't have cystic fibrosis, but I had celiac, of course, which meant I only had to avoid gluten. However, I've had more recent tests as an adult, and I don't have celiac either. So I don't know what to think of that whole story. All I know is that there's fairly serious diagnoses. It put my parents into an alarm. They prayed for me, and in the course of that, my dad actually made some kind of a bargain with God that if he'd heal me, I'd be dedicated to the ministry. But my dad, although I was healed, my dad never directed me to the ministry. But I did have, from that early time, certainly from kindergarten at least, if not later, very much an interest in the things of God. We went to church, went to the First Baptist Church at Covina after we moved there. I was 5 when we moved to Covina, which is in Southern California. And I was there in that town from kindergarten up through my junior year of high school. So from about age 5 to age 16, I lived in Covina, and we went to the Covina First Baptist Church. I remember the stories in the Bible, the sermons that the pastor gave, although he was I have to say, a very boring preacher, and I would fall asleep in church, but I had to sit there with my parents. But whenever I heard the Bible quoted, it stuck with me. It just struck that that's the word of God. That was an important thing to me. When I got older, I wanted to read through the Bible. And I believe when I'm guessing probably about 10 years old, probably was the first time I tried to read through it. I wasn't able to. I was not a very good reader, but I wanted to read through it. Got through Genesis probably and didn't get much further than that. Put it aside. probably a year or two later, I decided to read through the Bible again and got started again, didn't get very far. But I mean, the thing that in retrospect for me right now, I find remarkable is that I actually wanted to, because to me, it always seemed obvious. God is the most important thing there is. And how could, if there's a book that is the Word of God, how could anyone not want to know everything that's in it? And I assumed that everyone we knew had the same interest I did, because I went to church. I had friends from church in the children's group that I grew up with there. And my parents and grandparents and relatives were all Christians. So I kind of thought everybody who was an adult, at least, was a Christian. And some of you have heard me tell the story about how in second grade, our teacher showed us a film strip that was about the creation of the solar system. And it basically said that the Earth, originated from the sun, from an explosion on the sun. Molten gases were cast out from the sun far enough to cool down, but not far enough to leave the sun's orbit. And so I'm putting it in a little more adult terms now than they did in second grade, but basically they were saying that the Earth was formed from the sun. And that I had no idea that my teachers wouldn't be Christians or Bible believers. I thought all adults were smart enough to know that the Bible was true. I knew some of the kids my age maybe didn't, but they weren't very smart. And I mean, they're second graders, but I figured that everyone by the time they grow up would know this. But it just, something didn't set right with me. And so I thought about that through the whole recess. In fact, I walked around the perimeter of the schoolyard for the whole recess thinking about that film strip that they'd shown. And I finally figured it out. And after recess was over, I came back to the teacher. I said, Miss Burke, I think that film about the Earth was not true. I think they made a mistake. And she said, oh, really? What do you think was the mistake? And I said, well, it said that the Earth broke off from the sun, but the Bible says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then the sun was made like later. And so I don't see how the Earth could come from the sun. And she said, well, I guess they forgot or something. And that was the end of that conversation. But it never occurred to me that anyone would be trying to present deliberately any kind of a scheme of creation or Earth's history that was contrary to the Bible. I just figured everyone believed the Bible, of course. And so I grew up in Covina, going to Covina First Baptist Church. By the time I was in junior high, I kind of knew I wanted to be in the ministry, but I had no idea what the ministry looked like. There's no such thing as Bible teaching in my realm of experience. Our pastor wouldn't teach the Bible. He'd give sermons. They'd have some Bible verses in them, but he didn't teach the Bible. I went to Sunday school, but they didn't teach the Bible either. They taught from little booklets and things like that. And so, I mean, the concept of teaching the Bible was simply foreign to me. It never crossed my mind. But I knew that I did like to see people get saved. Didn't happen very often in our church because our pastor was a pretty poor preacher, pretty boring actually. But once in a while, I guess the Holy Spirit would move someone to get saved and they'd go forward. And as soon as someone went forward, I thought, oh, that's fantastic. Somebody just got saved. To me, that was thrilling to me. All through my youth, it was thrilling, the thought of people getting saved. So by junior high, when I figured I'm probably going to go in the ministry, I couldn't say I really had a voice from God or a call from God, and my parents had not specifically directed me that way. I just figured, well, I don't think I want to be a pastor, because frankly, the only pastor I was aware of, my own at our church, didn't seem to have a very exciting job, and he didn't see many people saved. But Billy Graham was a hero of mine, and he saw people saved all the time. So I kind of thought maybe crusade evangelist would be a cool thing to be. So from my early teens, that was something that crossed my mind. I actually began to witness to people. I gave my first talk presenting scientific evidence against evolution when I was in 8th grade. And the teacher, as an English class, the teacher liked it enough to pull me out of some of my other classes to have me come teach her other periods and teach there. And I just developed that presentation over the years into, well, we have now a much expanded version of that at our website under Creation and Evolution. But that was always a special interest of mine. I was always interested in biology and animals and stuff like that. I mean, I liked all kinds of animals. I especially liked reptiles, had a lot of snakes, large lizards, had an alligator once and stuff when I was young. And just, I've always fascinated by animals and reptiles in particular. I got really interested in opossums. Some of you may have noticed on my Facebook page, I've got some pictures of them, but that I've caught. But I raised several opossums when I was in my early teens, and I'd take them to the grammar school that I'd gone to previously. And my sixth grade teacher, I'd been his favorite student, so he would let me come in with my possum and give lectures about them to the students in his sixth grade classes. I was by this time in high school. But anyway, so I had this interest in animals too. So I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do in terms of ministry. I kind of thought maybe I'd do ministry on the side and maybe be a herpetologist or something like that. At one point, I thought I would become a lawyer. I was encouraged by a Christian lawyer to go that direction, and almost did. I actually took some steps to go that way, but chose not to do that in the end because God directed me a different way. And that direction, a different way, came about by my dad being transferred in his job with the Edison Company from Covina, where I'd grown up, to Orange, which is in Orange County, Southern California. But Orange was only about 40 miles away, but when you don't have a car and you're a teenager living at home, you know, it might as well be 100 miles or 1,000 miles away. So I was very unhappy about moving from Covina to Orange. I didn't know anyone in Orange County. I'd been from kindergarten to age till grade 11 in the same town with the same friends. So I was very resistant, but nothing I could do about it. We moved to Orange. And this was something that really God really had that in mind, to be sure. We had never heard of the Jesus movement, but it was just starting up in Orange County, not very far from Orange where we moved. It was in Costa Mesa. Now, again, I was reluctant to go to Orange, but had to go. But the first day I was in Orange High School, I met a guy named Michael Moore. And I know there's a very famous Michael Moore that is not a friend of mine, but this is a lesser known Michael Moore. And he was a godly kid and a musician. And we kind of started hanging together. And he said, you know, we thought about starting a band. I forgot to mention my family, everyone in my family plays music. My parents and my siblings are all musicians, and I grew up playing instruments and singing and stuff. But anyway, he was a guitar player too, so we thought about starting a band, not specifically a Christian band, though we were both Christians. And he said, "Well, you know, you ought to come to me to the church I'm going to. It's called Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa." He said, "There's a lot of bands play there, a lot of Christian bands play there." Well, I'd never heard a Christian band. But, and even though I was raised in the church, we were 40 miles away from Orange County. We were not even connected to the Jesus movement over there. And so I went to Calvary Chapel with them, and it was just a revival. It was a revival going that just thrilled me. I especially liked the fact that people were getting saved there a lot. Most of them were hippies because that's what the young people were. It was a revival among young people essentially my generation, my age. And the place was packed out. It was a small church. There was absolutely no hype, literally no hype at all. Chuck Smith, the pastor, was very laid back, very slow speaking, did not dramatize, didn't wave his arms, didn't dance around the stage, did nothing to command attention, but he just taught the Bible. The night I went the first time, a guy named Lonnie Frisbee was preaching. He's considerably more flamboyant than Chuck Smith. He was a hippie who had gotten converted not too long before that, but had been God had really given him an anointing to be an evangelist, and people wanted to get saved when they heard him preach. And I went to there, and heard him preach. I thought, well, this is great, man. That's a powerful message. That people got saved in large numbers. There was a band called Love Song that was playing there. I just found out a couple months ago when I was talking to some of the guys in Love Song. I didn't realize this. That was the first night they played there. They eventually played at Calvary almost every time they had meetings. But my first night at Calvary Chapel on a Wednesday night was apparently also their first night playing there. They were kind of the roots of the Jesus movement revival. What we call contemporary Christian music now is not really the same thing. Contemporary Christian music now is very slick, very professional, very commercial. Jesus music was played by people who had been secular musicians and they got saved. And they stopped writing songs that were secular, started writing songs to evangelize their unsaved friends. So instead of the bands back then being worship bands, they weren't worship bands, they were evangelistic bands. And many times the guys in the bands hadn't been saved very long themselves. In fact, when Love Song was playing there, they had to wait. They couldn't play at the beginning of the service. They had to wait until later because one of their band members had to get out of jail. He was doing time for marijuana possession or something like that, and he was getting out that night, and so he showed up a little late because of that. But they were just brand new Christians themselves out of a hippie background, and they were really good musicians. I remember thinking, wow, these are some of the best musicians I've heard, Christian or not. And I was very drawn. There were lots of bands there, actually. Love Song was the main one. They were like the Beatles of the movement. There are quite a few other good bands. Eventually, Michael Moore and I and my sister and some of her friends started a Christian band called New Wine. And we played together lots of places, at Calvary sometimes, but also there were a lot of coffee houses around, which were places where people could come in, get a free cup of coffee, a donut, sit and listen to a band playing, a Christian band playing live, and be evangelized. And a lot of people got saved in those, and our band played in a lot of those coffee houses. But I need to say that before our band got formed, the thing I discovered first and significantly at Calvary Chapel was that they believed in something I'd never heard of called the baptism in the Holy Spirit. I knew these people had something I didn't. I was a sincere believer and wanted to see people saved and so forth. But my relationship with God was fairly dry, I'd have to say, in my early life. I'd get excited about God at times when I'd see people get saved, for example, at a Billy Graham crusade or something like that. But as far as my walk with God, my knowledge of God was more or less by hearsay. And as far as having a dynamic walk with God, I didn't even know that was possible. Didn't even know it was even supposed to happen. I just believed that getting saved was getting your essentially guarantee of going to heaven when you die. And my interest in reading the Bible and learning more about God, that was just the direction I was leaning. It never occurred to me that you have to do that to be a good Christian. I just wanted to know more about God and the Bible all my life. So when I came to Calvary Chapel the first night, there was a hippie guy there who'd gotten saved, and he was a new convert. He asked me if I knew the Lord. And I knew that phrase, so I said yes. And then he said, well, what's the Lord been doing in your life? And that phrase I didn't know. I didn't know anything about the Lord doing things in people's lives. In mine, again, I thought of Christianity means you accept Jesus, and then I guess you go to church and you be a Christian, and then you go to heaven when you die. But that God would do things in your life, or that you have an interactive relationship with God, was an entirely foreign concept. I mean, he could have been speaking Swahili, and I wouldn't have understood any better what it was saying. But as I went to Calvary Chapel, which I did every night for several years, to hear Chuck and other preachers, Lonnie, I found that everybody there knew something I didn't know, and that was about something called the baptism of the Spirit. So I was curious about that. I went home. I'd studied that out over a period of some weeks or so. I was looking in the Bible, see what that was about. And I decided that was really something the Bible does talk about. And so I went back to Calvary Chapel on another night. I'd been going fairly regularly. I went to Lonnie Frisbee, who was the hippie preacher who'd been preaching the first night I went. I had him lay hands on me, and I got baptized in the Spirit, which changed my whole life. I won't go into all kinds of detail because it's important, but it revolutionized my whole life. When I read the Bible, it was a different experience. When I prayed, it was a different experience. And it wasn't just, at that time, it was like the permanent turning point in my knowledge of God, frankly. It was more like knowing God other than by hearsay, having a personal and dynamic awareness of God. Not like I feel him. It wasn't an emotional experience. I'm not an extremely, I don't really, what should I say? I don't really try to stir up my emotions or anything like that. I'm much more interested in being rational about things, but I mean, definitely it was something I experienced and do experience still. I mean, my relationship with God is like, he's somebody I know. He's not just somebody I know about, as it was before. And, I feel like I know him like I know anyone in my household or any friend of mine. Honestly, it's not just, that may sound like just religious talk, but for me, there's nothing religious about it. It's just the reality of God in my life changed then when I was 16 years old. And that because so many people were getting saved, young people, there were a lot of new Christian young people in my high school. I was by this time, it was in my senior year. I started meeting at lunchtime with other Christians. Typically, we would all go to Calvary Chapel every night. And then the next morning or next day at lunch, we'd get together and have our lunch and just talk about whatever was taught at Calvary Chapel the night before. So we're just talking about the things of the Bible. I actually did not feel like I knew much. I did know more than they did, but most of them were new Christians and I was not. Most of them had never read the Bible before, and I had. Not the whole thing, but I had some biblical literacy. And so they asked me if I'd start teaching the Bible to them. Now I was 17 years old and I'd never taught the Bible. I hadn't even read the whole thing through. But I thought, well, if you want me to, I could try. And so I began doing that every day. And it was something that came very, very readily to me, teaching the Bible. I remember being surprised at how many cross-references would come to my mind when I'm trying to talk about a certain passage, relevant stories from the Bible, relevant cross-references. I thought, well, I didn't even know I knew that much of the Bible. But anyway, I got a kind of a reputation in the school for being a Bible teacher and the Jesus freaks there. And by the way, my friend Michael Moore there were two lunchtimes. He was at the other lunchtime and he started teaching a Bible study at the other one. So he and I were in a band together, and he was leading a Bible study every day at lunch, at one of the lunches, and I was leading one at the other. When we graduated from high school, Michael and I moved in together with another guy, another Christian guy, and we lived in an apartment, shared the rent. And that was that when I got out of high school, there were opportunities for me to teach because there was still, the Jesus movement was in full swing. Thousands of people were being saved just at Calvary Chapel every month. And then there were all these coffee house ministries where people were getting saved. And our band was playing regularly 3 times a week in different coffee houses all over Southern California. And I was the preacher in the band. Every band had to have a preacher because they were not there to entertain. In those days, the bands, we would frown on audiences applauding because we thought that seems carnal. We're not here for you to applaud for us. We're not here to entertain. We're here to preach to you, And our music was written to preach. It was preaching music, preaching the gospel. And every band that was a Christian band had to have somebody at least who could get up afterwards and give an invitation or could present the gospel. And I was the guy in our band who did that. And so I was in that band for about 2.5 years. And then it broke up because too many of our members were getting married, including me. During that time, I met my first wife, and we got married in 1972. I was 19 years old. One reason for doing that so young was just I was eager to be married. I guess maybe I was tired of being a virgin, and I intended to stay a virgin until I got married. And frankly, when you're teaching Bible studies, and there's a lot of admiring faces looking at you, including some pretty ones, I thought, I don't need this kind of temptation. I don't want that. So, you know, I met this woman who's happened to be going to all our studies. She was highly recommended to me by a couple of friends of mine as a good Christian. She was living in a Christian ministry house when I met her. And so we rather hastily got married. I had met a guy in Southern California who was visiting from Germany, a young man my age, and he was fascinated by the Jesus movement. He was a youth minister at a Baptist church in Germany. And he said, you know, Steve, if you ever can come to Germany, I can set you up to speak all kinds of places there. And so after he'd gone back to Germany, I had contacted him and said, yeah, let's do that. Why don't I come over there and I'll speak for you? And it was after we set up a time for me to go that I met the girl that I later married as my first wife. And so we got married and then went to Germany. We made a trip across country by car and then flew to Germany, and we're there for 5 weeks. And he had me teaching 2 or 3 or 4 times a day in schools, churches, home meetings. He just kept me busy. He translated for me. But yeah, there wasn't a day off there, and I loved it. I just loved it. And the Jesus movement was happening over there in Germany too. On the trip across country, I decided I was going to go by faith. I'd heard about George Mueller and Hudson Taylor and people who never would let people know their needs. And so I thought, well, this would be a good way to test that way of life out. Because I was 19, I got married. I bought a car for $50 from my friend John Wickham. Now, some of you might know his son, Phil Wickham. John Wickham was in quite a few Christian bands in the Jesus movement, and he was in our band. He went to high school with me, and he was in our band. He went to Germany with us, in fact, but he flew there, and my wife and I drove, and I bought his car from him for $50, drove from California to the East Coast and flew to Germany. But on that trip across country, I allowed myself a month, and I didn't have any money. I had this $50 car that could hardly run, and I had about $50 that I'd saved up for gas. Now, back then, you could buy gas for 30 cents a gallon, but still, driving a 3,000 mile trip on $50 in gas was going to be a challenge. But the Lord provided for me everywhere I went. And I never told anybody I was traveling by faith or that I didn't have money. That was a conviction. I was never going to tell anyone whether I had needs or not, because I wanted to make sure, you know, if I'm working for God, there's one way I'll know. He'll support it. If he doesn't support it, then I must not be doing what he wants. And I've spoken in quite a few places across the country, churches, coffee houses and stuff. And the Lord just provided wonderfully for us, including providing our plane fare after we got to the East Coast. We went to Germany for 5 weeks. My wife became pregnant over in Germany, and we returned expecting a baby. And my daughter, Gypsy, was her name, was born in 1973. One reason we named her Gypsy was because the conservative Christians in Germany called us gypsies as a term of contempt. I had long hair. We were hippie-looking people. And you know, some of the Baptist and conservative Christians over there didn't like our looks or our lifestyle. Our lifestyle was godly, but the fact that we're traveling around without visible means of support seemed kind of irresponsible, obviously. So they just called us gypsies. And so my daughter was conceived over there. We decided we'll name her Gypsy because it went well with the last name also, I thought. So Gypsy is now 49 and has never married, doesn't have any kids, and lives not too far from me now. She did live kind of far from me for some years in New Orleans, but she now lives about an hour away from me, which is nice. Her mother left me. Her mother was not as solid a Christian as I had judged her to be. She had a couple of affairs after we got married. Eventually, she just ran off and divorced me, left me with the baby. Gypsy was 1 year old when my wife left. So we were married for 2 years, had a baby after 1 year, and she left me after 2 years, and I had a 1-year-old baby. So I was a single dad for quite a few years, and then I married again later. But so I was 21 when I was a single dad the first time with Gypsy, and I moved to Santa Cruz up in Northern California from Southern California because my friend Michael Moore had moved up there and had started a house ministry, and he invited me to come up and start teaching up there. I had nothing better to do. I was ready to have a kind of a new start since my wife had left me. And I took my daughter and we went up to Santa Cruz, and I began to minister up there. I met an important person in my life there named Danny Lehman. He's now one of the chief leaders in Youth with a Mission, which I had not, I didn't know much about Youth with a Mission. When we were in Germany, we'd run into some Youth with a Mission people in Munich during the Olympics in 1972. And they had a big castle with about 1,000 young people staying in it and going out and evangelizing on the street. So we had stayed with them for 3 days back when I was 19, but that's the only thing I'd ever heard of Youth with a Mission. Didn't have any further contact with them when I came back to the States. But a friend named Danny Lehman, who I met when I moved to Santa Cruz and who was living in the ministry house with my friend Michael Moore, he later became a Youth with a Mission leader and invited me to speak there too. So that was my connection to Youth with a Mission at a later date. But this is now 1974. I moved to Santa Cruz and I met Danny, met some other people I'll skip over just because I don't have time to go into them. I worked at a pizza parlor to pay my minimal expenses. I lived in Christian houses with other Christians. I headed up a ministry house on the east side of Santa Cruz, which we simply called the Discipleship House. We had about a dozen people living there some of the times, and Bible studies there and outreach from there. Danny Lehman, the friend I mentioned earlier, he also ran a Christian house in Santa Cruz on the other side of town. And so we were kind of partners in ministry there. Ran a discipleship school in the summer of 1975, 12 weeks long, for people who were getting saved at a coffee house ministry we had. These were high schoolers. They'd come in their summer break between junior and senior year, gave up their whole summer break to go sit in classes 6 hours a day, which I taught all of them for 12 weeks, taught through half the Bible in that time. The next summer, the same people came back, gave up their next summer to go through the other half of the Bible with me. So, I mean, they were just Bible all day long, but that was 1975 and 76. I'm trying to skip over a lot of things. I moved to Oregon in 1978 to start a ministry house in Albany, Oregon, but it didn't work out. I won't go into the details now, but it just didn't work out. We did it for maybe 6 months, I forget, and it just wasn't going to work out. So we all split up and went back to where we'd been. In my case, I went back down to Southern California from Oregon. And I had heard a rumor that Keith Green, who was a new musician at the time, a Christian musician, he'd had one album out, and but he was very popular in the music scene, that he had started a Christian community in the LA area in Woodland Hills. And I was curious about that. And so I went down to visit him, and I spent a couple weeks with him. And he actually wanted me to move there. He had about 60 something people living in a bunch of rented houses. He owned a house or two and had those filled up with people. And then he rented like 4 more houses and filled those up with people. There were about 60 something people living in community in the LA area. And I stayed with them for a while, wondering if I might move in. And that's how I got to know Keith. And he definitely urged me to move. In fact, when I turned him down because it turned out that I didn't feel that's what God was leading me to do, he actually got angry. He got angry at me for not accepting his invitation. Those of you who may know of Keith Green, he was kind of an intense guy. And he kind of felt that everything he said was a word from the Lord. I love Keith Green, by the way, and now deceased. He died at age 28. He's exactly my age. We're both born in 53. But his music was wonderful. He was a great guy, but he was a very immature Christian in those days. In fact, he told me he'd only been saved for 2 years at that time. And I'd been in the ministry for, I don't know, what, 6 years or something at that time. But he wanted me to move in and become an elder in his community. But I had a 5-year-old daughter I was raising, and I thought, I don't think this is the right place for most of these people who are recent drug addicts who were just converted through his ministry and moved in to this discipleship situation. I thought, there's no children, except I'm not going to bring my 5-year-old daughter there. So I told him no, and he was kind of upset with me. He said I was being a rebel against, what the Lord wanted me to do. But I never worried about people calling me that. And I did what I felt like I needed to do anyway. So I left him. But I still stayed friends with him. I got a job because I didn't have anything better to do, driving a truck for a Christian guy, delivering pottery to nurseries. And I did that for about 1.5 years. During that time, I'd moved back in with my parents because my daughter was 5 and needed to start going to school, I thought. So my parents would watch her while I'd work full time. And I'd also visit Keith once in a while. We'd connect. And at one point, Danny Lehman, whom I've mentioned earlier, came down to visit Keith and asked me to go with him. So we did. And Keith was moving to Texas to start a ministry down there. And he invited Danny to move down there and lead a school of discipleship down there. And Danny later instead went into Youth with a Mission and led schools there. But at that point, Keith kind of apologized to me for being angry at it. And we parted on good terms. But anyway, I didn't go the Keith Green community route. And I don't regret that I didn't. Although Danny and I have thought about this and talked about this before, how that we didn't know, of course, Keith was going to die. But Keith was putting out a magazine at those days that had 400,000 subscribers that he was writing articles for. And I remember Danny once said after Keith died, Steve, Keith invited you and me both to be leaders in his community. If we had, we'd be writing those articles and 400,000 people would be reading our articles today, But we kind of laughed at the irony of that situation because both of us had turned him down about ministering with him. But we both really admire him. He was a great guy. During the time that I was working, I also took some time off, went to Germany a couple more times to preach in the same areas I'd preached the first time. And then I met, in 1980, in Southern California, I met my second wife. I actually was attending a home Bible study led by Lonnie Frisbee, who was the first preacher I ever heard when I went to Calvary Chapel 10 years earlier. Lonnie had a home Bible study, and I went there, and June was her name. She was attending there. It's a long story how we got together. It's a great story, but I don't have time to give it all. But we decided that we would get married and should get married, and did. And as some of you know, she was killed in an accident 6 months later. When we got married, we moved from Orange County up to Santa Cruz again, where I'd lived before. And I started teaching up there. I started teaching a morning Bible study in a restaurant every day at 6 or 6:30 in the morning. And we had about 40 people coming to that every day, 5 days a week, and did that for about 1 year in that restaurant. And then they wanted us to move out of there. So we did it in another location. A smaller group came to the later location in a home. Eventually, I stopped doing that when I was offered a property in Oregon to start a school, which was the Great Commission School. Now, I've skipped over a bunch here. When June died, I was doing this morning Bible study. And there was a man and his wife and his daughter attending that. His name was Keith Larkin. He was an extremely successful businessman, multimillionaire, who gave all of his money to missions, essentially all of his money to missions. And I really liked him. He liked me. And so we got acquainted. He would take, even before June died, he would take us, Gypsy and June and me, on flights. He flew places. So he had a plane. And he was just really a great guy who gave all his money away to charities and stuff, and lived very modestly himself. And he was just, frankly, he was my kind of guy. I really admired him. But when June died, he and his wife began to plot to put me together with their daughter. Now, their daughter's name was Kristen. She had been in YWAM, that is Youth with a Mission. She had been to Bible school. She had been saved for several years. She was active in street evangelism in Santa Cruz, seemed to be a real on fire Christian. And frankly, she was a very attractive woman. And the fact that her parents liked me didn't hurt either, because my first wife's parents didn't like me, and June's parents didn't like me much. They were Catholics. And so, I thought, well, this is a win-win. Eventually, Kristen and I got married, and Keith, her father, bought a property up in Oregon, which is an old campus, and asked me if I wanted to run a school on it. And that was 1983. I was now an elder at Calvary Chapel in Santa Cruz for a few years. And I moved up there with several families, about seven families moved up with me. Some of them were deacons in the church and their wives. I was an elder. And we started a school, a 9-month school, where I taught through the whole Bible verse by verse in 9 months. Again, teaching about 6 hours a day. And the second year, I had some help from another teacher who was a friend of mine, took some of the load off. The next year, I had raised up some of the students who were quite gifted to teach some of the less risky books, and eventually, after running that school, I ran the school for 16 years, and eventually quite a few of our alumni were teaching, plus I brought in local pastors and other teachers I knew. But right up to the end, the school ran from 83 to 99 in Oregon. I was, even at the end, still teaching over half of the books of the Bible, but we had about a dozen other teachers we were using as well. That was a pretty neat thing. A lot of people told me that changed their lives, going through the whole Bible in 9 months, living in a community campus and eating together and worshiping together, having prayer meetings together every day, classes, hours a day for solid 9 months. And they'd go through the whole Bible. That's where most, the lectures we have on our website of me teaching verse by verse through the books of the Bible, that's where most of those were originally recorded, although I have redone a lot of them since then, because that was a long time ago those were done. But the first lectures we ever posted on our website were those from the school. When we started our website, I was still running the school. And so that's how our site was populated with so many lectures right from the very beginning, because we had tapes, cassette tapes of everything. We digitized them, put them up. So I ran that school for 16 years. It started out in a little coastal town called Bandon. Eventually, we had to move it from Bandon after 6 years to McMinnville, Oregon, and ran it for 10 years there. During the years that I was running the school, I had 4 more children. My daughter Gypsy was 11 when the second child was born, and it's a boy named Benjamin who goes by Ransom. There's a long story behind that, but we were going to call him Ransom and changed our mind when he was born, and when he grew up, he wanted to be Ransom, so that's who he is now. He's in his late 30s now. 2 years later came a girl, Hannah, and then 2.5 years after that, another girl named Elizabeth, and then about 3 years after that, a little boy named Tim, who is now 30-something, 31 maybe, 30, I'm not sure. I think he just turned 30. No, I forget. He's recently 30. So I have 5 children total. I have Gypsy, who's 11 years older than the next oldest, and then I have 4 others. By Kristen. Kristen and I were married for 20 years, and then something happened. I do not know what. Eventually, she just got, I don't know, maybe she got tired of it or whatever. She just snapped and left the kids and left me. She'd been a very devoted homeschooling mom, very conservative, devoted Christian woman, it seemed. And, never would have dreamed she would have done it. But one day she just turned on her heels and left the family, never looked back. And that was 20-something years ago, I guess. So I raised the remaining 4 children that she left behind. So I was a single dad twice. My first wife left me with a baby, a 1-year-old, and I was a single dad for the next 6 years before I remarried. And then after 20 years, Kristen left, and we had 4 kids at home. So I was a single dad again, Gypsy now being grown and out of the house. And I raised those kids to adulthood and for the next 10 years. And that was from 2001 to about 2012, I guess it would be. And we were in Idaho at the time. We had moved to Idaho in 1999 because the church had invited us up there. I'd closed down the Great Commission School. I'd started the radio show, The Narrow Path, in 1997. I should probably say something about that. That's the same year I put out my first book that's still in print, the Revelation 4 Views, came out in 1997. That's also the year I started The Narrow Path. Now, I had for 7 years before that been a guest host on someone else's program. A guy named Ron Reed had a program daily. And he had me first as a guest and then as a substitute host. And eventually I was his regular Monday night host, and he was taking 3-day weekends. So I was on his program for some years. And then he's the one who suggested that I start my own program. And I told him, I don't know anything about the radio business. I'm just a Bible teacher. And he said, well, I know the business. He said, I'll do the legwork for you. So he went and he negotiated something with the radio station and got us started. And so the Narrow Path got started in 97. When my wife, Kristen, left in 2001, the Narrow Path had been on the air for 4 years. And I just went right off the air. As soon as she left, that day, I went off the air. I just stopped, and I didn't travel. I didn't have a newsletter. I didn't have following of it. I mean, that I knew of. I didn't keep in touch with any. I was just raising my kids at home for the next year. So I was out of the ministry. And then after a year, some of the stations approached me that I'd been on and wanted me to come back on. So I took some money to go back on the air. It took a lot of money. But my grandmother died around 2003, I guess, and left $50,000 to the Narrow Path, which was enough to pay for a year on 2 different stations to prepay for. So that's how the Narrow Path got back on the air again, and has been on the air ever since, and has grown to a lot of things. Now, my kids grew up during that next 10 years, moved out, and I met Dana. And I'm going to bring it to that, and I think that's going to probably be there's a lot more things I could give, but I'm no sense giving them all tonight. Don't have that much time. People often ask how I met Dana. Well, I was living in Santa Cruz. She was living in the house we live in now in Southern California, in Temecula. She was a college professor. She is retired since we got married, but she was 40 years an art professor at Riverside Community College here in Southern California. And I was living 400 miles north in Santa Cruz, but my kids being pretty much grown up by this time, by about 2010, my kids were mostly grown up. In fact, they were all grown up, but 2 of them were still at the house. And I decided to start reconnecting with my family in Southern California. My parents were down here. My brother and sister were down here, and 2 of my daughters lived down here. So I thought, well, once a month, I'm going to go down and spend a weekend in Southern California, visit my family down there. It was a long trip from Santa Cruz, but I thought I could make that once a month. So I did. I started going there once a month. And there was a family down in Orange County that had known me in Oregon. And they said, listen, if you're coming down once a month to Orange County, why don't you come teach a Bible study in our home when you're down? So I decided I would. They were in Lake Forest, which is about an hour from Temecula, where I live now. And Dana had found my website and had been listening to my lectures. She commuted about an hour each way to work every day to the college where she taught. And so she would listen to my lectures as she commuted. So she'd listen to me for about 2 hours a day. We hadn't met, but she liked my teaching. She'd been a Christian all her life. She'd been raised in churches. She's had quite a few good Bible teachers. Some of you may know who Kay Arthur is. Kay Arthur, very well-known for her inductive study Bible and her classes and radio broadcasts. Well, when she was just getting started, Dana actually went to one of Kay Arthur's very first schools in, I think it was Kentucky or Tennessee. And Dana was working with some Jesus people stuff in the Midwest because she was from Indiana. But she had moved after growing up and she got married and moved to Arizona, then to Southern California. And her husband left her and was cheating on her and living with someone else. And they got divorced about 8 years before I met her. And I had been divorced for 10 years when my wife had left me. And so Dana was listening to my lectures, not ever really thinking that we'd meet, because she liked the teaching. And she found out from the website that I was going to be holding monthly meetings in a home in Lake Forest, which is not close to her, but closer than Santa Cruz. So she was involved in the singles group at Calvary Chapel in Marietta down here, and very, very well connected. So she invited some of her friends from that group to come out and hear me the first time I was down there in Southern California. So I met her there. She came back the next month. And frankly, she came back every month. And so we got acquainted that way. There was a mutual attraction, but we lived pretty far away from each other. But, we were able to Skype and things like that. So we got interested in each other. My parents got very interested in her and me getting together too. In fact, my dad eventually said, if I don't ask her to marry me, he was going to ask her. But he didn't have to, because I was getting pretty eager to do that myself. So eventually, after we started dating and stuff, and after we'd been doing that for about a year, I proposed, and several months later we got married in our backyard here. So I moved, when we married, I moved down from Santa Cruz to here in Temecula, in this house. Dana had been buying this house for 12 years before we knew each other. And so a lot of it had been paid off. And we got married almost 11 years ago. We're going on up to our 11th anniversary soon. She has 2 grown sons and a grandson. Her grandson was 8 when I met her, but he's now in the Marines. So between us, we have 7 kids. So that brings us, frankly, up to date. Obviously, I've written some more books. The only book I have in print now that I wrote before I knew Denny is the Revelation book. And then after we're married, actually, the first time we had what we might call a date, we had lunch together. We got to talk about all kinds of biblical subjects, and she was interested in hell. And I was telling her about the 3 views of hell, and she was thrilled to hear that there were different views of hell. And so, I mean, that's when she, I think, really got interested in me when talking about hell, because I have hanging on the wall here something that she gave me as a plaque. It says, "You had me at hello," but the O is crossed out. So it says, "You had me at hell." And that was really kind of when she knew she was interested in me, when we were talking about the 3 views of hell. Anyway, she said, "Well, if we get married, you have to write a book on that before we get married." Well, that gave me some motivation, but I actually didn't get it done. We got married. It was only partly done, and I got it finished the next year and published. And then since then, of course, I put up the 2-volume work on the Kingdom of God, and then more recently another book on against full preterism. So most of my writing has been done in the last 10 years since I met Dana, since we've been married. The radio program has expanded really incredibly in those same years. I think when I met her, I was probably on 5 or 6 stations, and now we're on, who knows, 50 something. Sometimes I hear 70, sometimes I hear 50. I don't count them, but I heard from a guy who kind of is our go-between between us and the radio stations. It's in the 50s somewhere now. So we're, the ministry's really expanded, frankly, since I married Dana, and since my kids have been adults. I really did set myself apart to raise those kids for the 10 years after the mother left. Anyway, I don't know that I have anything else I need to relate. It's been an hour.
Okay. Steve, do you mind if we go ahead and ask people to raise their hands if they have questions about your testimony? Is it okay?
Hey, God bless you.
Hi, Junior.
Hey, good to see you. This question is about your testimony. I would like to know, when was it, when did you decide to leave Calvary Chapel? Was it your understanding of the Bible more, or were you too busy, or what was it that was the last straw of you just leaving?
Well, there wasn't a last straw for me. It was probably more of a mutual agreement between us. First of all, I was in Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, back when it was the only Calvary Chapel, the original Calvary Chapel. During the 4 or 5 years that I was sitting under Chuck Smith, I was also doing my own study, and I reached some views different than Calvary on a few, especially eschatological things. And yet it wasn't a big problem to me. That is, I wasn't angry at Calvary Chapel or anything like that, and I didn't leave in a huff. But the reason I left there is because I moved to Santa Cruz, and there wasn't a Calvary Chapel in Santa Cruz initially. When I moved to Santa Cruz in 1974, I was moved up there because I was invited to be actually a worship leader in a Jesus People church that was forming up there, but it wasn't a Calvary Chapel. Now, years later, after I'd lived in Santa Cruz, a Calvary Chapel did get formed in Santa Cruz, and I eventually became an elder there. Now, I was an elder there for about 3 years. In fact, I was the main teacher in the Calvary Chapel. The senior pastor really respected me, even though he knew I didn't hold Calvary Chapel doctrines on eschatology. He happened to be very open-minded, which is something that Calvary Chapels often are not. But he thought I was a good teacher, and he wanted me to teach a lot. So I taught more than anybody on the eldership, or even more than the senior pastor. He was not full-time. He was a businessman, and he just volunteered to preach on Sundays and then be involved in pastoral work whenever he could. But the elders, of which I was one, did all the pastoral work during the week when he was at work and stuff. So he wasn't jealous over any kind of position or title or anything like that, and he respected me. He realized, frankly, that my teaching was pretty well established, biblically. And he even had a brother. He had a brother who was a Presbyterian Bible scholar who was amillennial. And even though my pastor was dispensational, he says, my brother who's amillennial knows the Bible a lot better than I do, he said. And so, I mean, he didn't think his brother was right, but he had to say his brother knew the Bible better than he did. And so he had respect for amillennialism. So it wasn't a problem between us. But after 3 years there, that's when I was offered this campus in Oregon to start a school. And actually, Calvary Chapel sent me and the 7 families that were with me, laid hands on us and sent us off to start the school as an extension of the church there. But we were not really operating as a Calvary Chapel school. Calvary Chapel already had their own schools that teach Calvary Chapel things, and we didn't teach. Our pastor just wasn't a denominationally hung up kind of a guy, and so they kind of endorsed us to go start the school, but it wasn't really a Calvary affiliate. But I still kind of remained an honorary elder at Calvary Chapel in the first couple of years I was in Oregon. But one of the deacons, who is a big Calvary Chapel partisan, sent his daughter up to our school. And as we're teaching through the Bible, certain things that she heard were not dispensational stuff, and she told her dad, and he went to the pastor and said, was that school that Steve started up there, is that a Calvary Chapel school or not? And then my pastor knew, okay, this is problematic. Not that the pastor had any trouble with me. He just knew there's going to be a problem here if we keep being a Calvary Chapel school. So I came down to visit with the elders, and we decided mutually that we just wouldn't say that we were affiliated. We wouldn't be a Calvary Chapel affiliate. We'd just be an independent school. And that was fine. And that pastor and I remained on good terms till he died. He's a great man. So but in Oregon, there wasn't a Calvary Chapel at that time. Interestingly enough, the campus we had in Oregon, the first one we had, got bought out by a Calvary Chapel years later, and now is a Calvary Chapel Conference Center. But when we moved to Oregon, there was no Calvary Chapel in the town there. Calvary Chapels was still a pretty small movement in those early years. And so they weren't everywhere like they are now. So I just kind of got phased out of Calvary Chapel. I never got kicked out of Calvary Chapel. And I never, left in a huff or stamped the dust on my feet. I've not really had a bad interaction with Calvary Chapel. In fact, when we were in McMinnville, Oregon, running the school for 10 years, the Calvary Chapel pastor there, he was a little scared of me, but I invited him to come and teach at our school, which he did. And we kind of made friends that way. He invited me to teach at his church then too. So, I mean, it's funny because he heard about our school and he heard about me before he and I met. We'd moved into the town. His name was Ron Smith. And I remember I decided to visit his church. He'd heard about me. And I showed up on a Sunday morning and he was on the porch greeting people coming in. He didn't recognize me because he had never met me. And I said, "Hi, I'm Steve Gregg. I'm the guy who runs the Great Commission School in town here." And he said, "Oh no," he says, "I'm teaching about the preacher of rapture today." And I said, "No worries. I expect Calvary Chapels to teach about the preacher of rapture. If I didn't want to hear that, I wouldn't come to a Calvary Chapel. It's not like you have to, feel you're going to offend me by teaching what you believe." And we became friendly, but he was still a little uncomfortable around me for a while. But then when I started inviting him to come teach some of the books of the Bible at my school, and I told him, "Listen, my students know I'm not dispensational. They know you are. And they know my views, and I don't mind you teaching your views. When you teach, a book of the Bible, don't feel like you can't say something that'll disagree with me. Preach it the way you believe it. My students, we encourage our students to listen to all sides and to discern." And so we became pretty good friends. And again, I was not in Calvary Chapel, but I've, for the most part, had good relations with Calvary Chapel guys. I didn't mention one of my trips I made cross country in 1975. I picked up a hippie. He and I remember it differently. I thought I picked him up in Denver. I think he thought I picked him up somewhere else, so I don't remember. But he was a hippie. Actually, he was from Connecticut, and he was down in Arizona selling drugs, and he was hitchhiking back to Connecticut. It just so happens that I and two people traveling with us in a van were going to Connecticut. So we picked him up, and he spent 2 days in the van with us as we'd have Bible studies together in the van. I'd sing Christian songs and talk to him about the Lord and stuff. And he just, he was just kind of keeping his cards close to his chest. We didn't know what he was thinking. But we needed to stop in Chicago for a few days, and he wanted to keep going. So we parted company with him. His name was Joe Pasquich. And so we didn't know it, but after we let him off, he decided to give his life to the Lord. Like on the on-ramp where he's hitchhiking, he just kind of surrendered to the Lord. And we didn't know it because we didn't think we'd ever see him again. Weeks later, we were in Connecticut. We visited a Jesus People coffee house, and he was there, and he was getting baptized the next Saturday. And he didn't know we were there when they announced that he was getting baptized. So we looked him up afterwards, and we were amazed, that he had gotten saved after we let him off. Well, years later, he started a Calvary Chapel in his home in Connecticut. And then later, he was a vineyard pastor, and now he's a Calvary Chapel pastor again. I didn't see him for 40 years, but Dana and I were back on the East Coast a few years ago. So we decided to visit him. And, I haven't seen him since he had first gotten saved. And now he's been pastoring for years, Calvary Chapel in New London, Connecticut. But we visited him with the whole day, and he had me teach at his church that night. But, it seems like all the Calvary Chapel pastors I know, I'm friends with. We don't have problems. It's just that there's lots of Calvary Chapel pastors I don't know. And to them, I'm just a false teacher on the radio teaching something different than what Calvary Chapels believe. So I've never really had unpleasantness with Calvary Chapel.
Well, I guess what I wanted to ask when hearing this was like, when did you stop calling yourself a Baptist?
I stopped calling myself a Baptist when I started going to Calvary Chapel. We'd been in the Baptist church all my life, but when we moved to Orange County, we never joined a Baptist church yet. My parents visited some, but they didn't care for them that much, so they started going to Calvary Chapel too. I took them there, and they went there for 25 years. So we all became Calvary Chapel people shortly after we moved, and we never were, loyally Baptist. We were Baptist because we went to a Baptist church, but I figured my views were Baptist. I thought the denomination was probably one of the more scriptural denominations at the time. But when I started going to Calvary Chapel, I realized that I thought Calvary was more scripturally oriented than the Baptist church I was at. So I just consider myself non-denominational ever since. I've never been part of a denomination since I was 16.
Steve, you want to close us in prayer?
Sure. Thank you, Father, for the fellowship we've been able to have here remotely on Zoom, and for the chance to recount what you've done in our lives and to interact with those who are far away, who are right here in the room with us by Zoom. This is great technology, and it helps us to have fellowship with people who at a different level than maybe some of the people we easily find around us locally. I pray that you bless each one of these people who've joined us tonight and their families. And we pray for our country, that you would save this country, even though we don't deserve it. We desperately need it. And we look to you as our King and rescuer. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.